Hey guys, Jake Carlson here, host of the Modern Leadership Podcast. Are you ready to focus on amplifying your leadership superpowers? Let's go! Good morning, my friends and fellow elite achievers. Welcome to Modern Leadership, the podcast where each week we sit down with authors, entrepreneurs, and leaders to explore their journey, diving into the ups, their downs, and ultimately the lessons they learned along the way. Our goal, of course, is to show that everything is figure-outable. Today's guest expert is Dr. Nashater Deu Solheim. Dr. Nashater is an author, the Leadership Pin Code, Unlocking the Key to Willing and Winning Relationships. She is the CEO and founder of Progressing Minds and an expert negotiator who studied at Harvard Law School. Additionally, she is a trained clinical and forensic psychologist with over 25 years of practical business experience. And today, she is our modern leader. Nashater, how are you?
I'm great, Jake. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you on the show and to really dive into this. I know you talk a lot about influence. I know you talk a lot about leadership, which is perfect for this podcast. But before we jump into all of that, take us back a little bit. Give us an idea of who you are on a personal level.
Oh, on a personal level, I'm British. You probably hear that from my accent. Born and brought up in the UK, in the heart of the UK, an area called the West Midlands. So geographically, there's a city called Birmingham, and I'm from a tiny little village almost on the outskirts of there. So I grew up in the UK and studied also in the UK psychology, which is really what forms the basis of my book. Come from a huge Indian family, British Indian family. There's 7 of us children. And I've got a son who's 15 years old now, and he's really heavily into ice hockey. So that keeps me busy as a hockey mum, as well as doing the work that I do now, working with in business as a coach.
Well, and the listeners of the podcast cannot see my smile, but they know I'm smiling because I coach my son's ice hockey team. We are a big ice hockey family as well. So we've got that to bond over.
Wow. Which team is that, Jake? You have to tell me, because he's going to ask me afterwards when I mention that. So I'll need to be able to sound like I know what I'm talking about.
So we live in Arizona. So our NHL team is the Arizona Coyotes, but we lived for 6 years in San Jose. So my son, who's 8, really feels passion for the San Jose Sharks. So we're kind of Sharks Coyotes fans over here. How about you guys?
Great. Well, we have a local team who were top of the league in the last season called Stavanger Oilers, and I'm actually on the board of the children's club that is associated with that for hockey itself. And my son's in that club, so I'm a huge fan of ice hockey. Follow the team, and he's a huge fan, of course, of NHL. So, but he's following his hero, who is Zuccarello, who used to play for New York Rangers, and I believe now is playing for Minnesota, if I'm correct.
Let's talk a little bit about leadership, shall we? So you got into this a number of years ago through the psychology route, but was that something as you were growing up that you had an interest in? How did you get into negotiation and this leadership of influence?
So I've always been interested in psychology for as long as I can remember. And the interest really came from being fascinated by the differences in people. I do wonder, and I've reflected on this myself, whether it's coming from a big family like I have and the differences between us and the commonalities, and really trying to work out whether that's nature, nurture, how much of it is, we're born with and how much of it is really something that's shaped by our experiences. So I've been interested in psychology pretty much as long as I've been studying at school and then went to university to study psychology. And I really wanted to work with making a difference to people's lives. So working with mental health, it was really what I wanted to do once I left university, and I trained to be a clinical psychologist. So then I was working with people who had a range of mental health issues, anxiety and depression and trauma and those kinds of things. But very quickly found myself quite fascinated by the extremes of people's experiences, right? So I wanted to know, how is it that somebody ends up on a pathway in life where perhaps they end up committing terrible crimes or having quite awful experiences themselves, and then perhaps going on to committing those same kinds of, let's say, behaviors towards other people. And that took me really into the field of forensic psychology. So I was working with mental health, but then I got interested in working with offenders who also have psychiatric problems. And what that looks like is, it may well be that they had committed their offenses and later on developed a mental health problem. And in other cases, it was really that their mental health or psychiatric illness was perhaps a trigger for their offending behavior. So I worked in a maximum security hospital for a while, which was really interesting to me, working with people who committed very dangerous crimes and also had mental health problems. So they were locked up in a hospital as opposed to a prison, so that we could also treat the mental health problem. And that's really where I got interested in kind of the persuasion and influence part of my work.
And this is very interesting. We get a lot of leaders on the podcast, and they all come from different backgrounds. They all come into leadership from their own route, their own path, their own, background, that kind of thing. And I'm interested in this because I started out as a psychology major in college. I wanted to be a child psychiatrist. And then I realized that I took way too much of my work home with me. And so as I listen to your story and your background, and I wonder about some of the experiences that you had and how you kept it separated and able to come home and still, raise your son, have a big smile on your face, which I've seen, and how your work impacted kind of your home life.
So it's a great question, because you are exposed when you're talking to people who've committed very heinous crimes. You're exposed to a lot of detail, a lot of information that you wouldn't otherwise perhaps come across. And it can be quite affecting or traumatizing even when you start to read what has happened perhaps to their victims or what they have feeling themselves about what they've done. But part of our training as clinical and forensic psychologists was really how to handle that, as well as how we work with those people, those patients, and ensuring that you had a very clear understanding about how much you both shared, but also keeping objective and as much as you can unbiased when you're doing that kind of work, so that you're not allowing your feelings to overwhelm you and to get into judging. You can imagine that it's very easy to get very judgmental sitting with people who've committed heinous crimes. So you've got to remain objective. The two tasks that we were really involved in was assessing the risk of this person committing the offense again. That was our primary task. And the secondary was to understand why they had committed those crimes, so that perhaps we could either help them to choose a different path in the future or work with society and those factors that may have triggered them to go down that path to prevent other people doing the same. So those two goals really that we had, which was to both manage risk and understand them, required some level of objectivity. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to build those relationships with them, build a trusting relationship where they would share information that you needed to know to be able to do that job. So one part of it was, yes, we were trained in how to remain objective and manage our own reactions and feelings and biases. And the other part of it was that we were always a part of a team where we would be able to go back and speak to either a supervisor who was following the work that we were doing, so they understood the kinds of issues that were coming up, the dynamics that were being raised, and you were always in a place to be able to share what was happening for you and the impact it was having on you, so that you did that before you went home and you did not take it home for that reason, that you were processing it with other people, making sense of what was happening to you and for your patient, and making sure that you were in a healthy place as you did that work.
And so let's relate this now to a lot of the listeners of this podcast are business owners. They're small business owners. They lead small teams, or they're on a team and they lead a subgroup of that team. And how do we take that, what you just talked about, this ability to separate the emotion out, but also be, caring, have a heart, be human in our work life, maybe in a situation that's not so much we're dealing with criminals, we're dealing with people who have committed crimes, but more in just our day-to-day work. How do we take those principles and apply it to our work?
Jake, it starts with really making sure that you know yourself and understand yourself, because in those situations where you're having either difficult conversations or you're trying to work with an employee or a colleague at work, and you may want to either persuade them over to your perspective or, you're trying to resolve some kind of disagreement, you need to understand your own reactions and biases first and look at how they might be affecting the dialogue that you're having or the interaction that you're about to have, as well as and this is really what I focus on in the way that I coach now. Once you've understood yourself, it's important then, instead of coming from a place of, well, what I now need is, and I'm going to start the conversation with the other person about what I need from them, is to spend some time then understanding what their needs are. What's in it for them? How can I make sure that not only do I get my needs met, but I also create the win-win in this conversation so that the other person also gets what they need from this conversation? And so what I learned in working with these patients was, it was one thing for me to be going in and saying, look, I need information to assess your risk, or I need information to make sure that we understand, why you committed your crime so that we can help you move on in a different way. But what was in it for them to share that information? They were locked up. So they didn't really have immediate gain in sharing with me. So I had to really make sure that I understood, well, perhaps what I need to make sure is that I sell the why to them. The reason this is going to be of benefit to you is that it's going to help you perhaps choose a different path in life going forward. So you have your freedom back, you reconnect with your family, or, whatever it was that was really their goal. I had to figure out what was important to them. And what I say to leaders is, the task for you is exactly the same. When you're speaking with your counterparts, then you need to think about not just what you want from the conversation, but what's in it for them. And if you find yourself always caught up in your own agenda or your own mind, then it's very likely that you will either not engage the other person or find yourself getting stressed or feeling misunderstood or frustrated. And that's what you take home. So to answer your question simply, I think it's so important that we understand our biases, what's affecting me, what's my mindset like when I'm going into these conversations, what am I carrying in with me that might make this successful or otherwise, and then very quickly think about what is it the other person needs from me in this conversation.
And another word that we could use for that, I'm thinking, is trust. I know you talk a lot about trust, and it's this ability to create trust between your team, between those you work with, your clientele, that kind of stuff. So let's talk a little bit about building trust. You talk about how it's simple. It's very, very simple to build trust, and you've come up with this 4-stage model for building trust. And I want to walk through those 4 stages and see if we can understand how we as leaders can build trust amongst our team.
Sure. So for me, trust is really at the core of every relationship that we are choosing to build. So whether it's a personal relationship, whether it's a work relationship, whether it's something that's going to be just functional, perhaps it's just to establish a contract of work with somebody, then we as humans really want to have a feeling that we can trust this person that we're building the relationship with. It's very important to us because it's where we feel safe. It's where we feel that we're on solid ground. It's where we feel that our needs are going to be met and we're also going to be respected and there's going to be reciprocation. That whatever good deed I do for you, it will be reciprocated. So trust is very much an important base of all human relationships.
I couldn't agree more. I think you're absolutely right.
Right. So I really have a focus on, let's start there. How do we build trust? And one of the things that I hear all the time from people I work with is, I'm being told I need to build trust with my team or my new team member or my new boss. But how do I do that?
Where do I start?
Expect it. Yeah. Can I just expect it? How do I just kind of throw it out there and make it happen? So I really had to give it some thought. And, having studied this in psychology, really trying to break down, well, what are the mechanics of trust that I can help people to understand so they can see themselves being able to do it in a very conscious way and get the best out of the relationships they're trying to build.
Well, and before we get into the 4 stages, I want to ask you, you said something there that really triggered my mind. And you said, shouldn't I be able to expect it? And I think about that in my own life and in my own business. Like, shouldn't I just be able to expect that the people I work with, the people I work for, the people who hire me, that I can trust them?
Wouldn't that be great?
Wouldn't it?
And wouldn't it be great? And then, I kind of ask myself the question, and it often comes up in my coaching sessions, well, let's say that you should or you could just expect it. How do you know that you have it? And, what is this thing that we're calling trust? So if we don't pay attention to the fact that we're building it, how do we really know we have somebody's trust?
Yeah, if we're not intentional about it.
If we're not intentional. And usually we suddenly find out we don't have it when things go wrong. So rather than finding that out further down the line, that actually, I didn't have it because I wasn't conscious about building it or checking that it was in place. And now I'm suffering because I realize I don't have the trust, or we don't have trust between us, and it's really hard to figure this issue out, then I think it's, in the working context, very important that we are both explicit and conscious about it. Because when I take you through the stages, you can see very easily how actually when it occurs naturally, when we're not conscious about it, it's these stages we've gone through. And all I've done really is kind of take the lid off them and say, you know what, when it works, this is what you were probably doing. Now, if you can be conscious about it when you need to be, you can actually go through these stages and build it.
Excellent. Well, let's jump right in then. Stage one.
Stage one. So you recognize this when, in a work environment, when you meet people for the first time you've never met before. And it might be at a networking event, it might be at one of those cocktail, kind of social events after work, or it might be that you're the newcomer in a team, or in a meeting, or actually somebody has joined your team that is new. But stage one is really the first encounter. And what we find we do in all kinds of situations, personal or business, is we're just checking ourselves out with the other person. Do we have that immediate pleasant encounter, conversation? Is the person nice and respectful? It's very light, very superficial encounter. And it's where we just figure out what I call the first layer of, do I like you? And do I have a good feeling? It may not be more than superficial conversation that you've engaged in. For example, where did you work before? Where have you come from? Where do you live? Oh, and you kind of look for common ground, because we're just seeking to see, how much this person is like me, or I'm going to like them. And, like we did at the beginning, Jake, we kind of found common ground on hockey, and it might just be that you figure out some of these light connections and commonalities that give you a good feeling, and you think, okay, at stage one, I'm just having a nice conversation and I like this person. If I meet them again, I'd probably follow up.
Yeah, and I think this is so important when we talk about sales, when we talk about encounters with our clients, we look at, what pictures they have on the wall, or what coffee mug that they're holding, or what t-shirt they're wearing, or whatever it is that kind of shares their personality, what they're interested in. The other day I was at the dentist. I was wearing my Captain America socks. The dentist looked down, saw the Captain America socks, and we had an instant bond as we talked about our shared love of Marvel in this case. But I see what we're talking about here in stage one. And the truth is, we as listeners of this podcast, we need to be intentional about looking for those common grounds, because the other person hasn't listened to this episode. The other person doesn't know that they're supposed to be building on this common ground. So stage one is this initial gut reaction, building upon common ground. Then we move to stage two. What do we do in stage two?
So this is where, having met the person and established the light touch, or the kind of superficial common ground, I think I remember where you lived, and we had a conversation about what you did that weekend. It was a very light touch, and it was a nice feeling. So when I meet you again now, I'm happy to build on that and move to stage two, which is digging a little deeper. And the conversations that take place here might be then referring back to our first conversation and asking, so how is your 15-year-old? I remember you mentioned that you had a 15-year-old, and, how's he doing? How's it going at school for him? And what you're looking for now in stage two is, what else do we have in common other than, superficial light touch, but much more around things like values, drivers, motivations, deeper interests. So it might be conversations, for example, around, how do you spend your weekends? Well, family is very important to me. So I tend to spend most of my time with the family, kicking the ball around with my kids, or, we have a cabin that we go to, whatever that is. But you're figuring out, this person places high importance on family values. Or it might be somebody who says, I'm a huge fitness fanatic and I spend my weekend, training for a marathon. I really value being outdoors. I really value having time to myself. And so in stage two, what we're trying to do is figure out whether we have common values, common drivers that are beyond the superficial. And if we find a connection here, I think, oh yeah, this person really, resonates with me, that they have similar values around family and taking care of the kids, or time for yourself, that it builds a deeper connection. You feel you get to know somebody at a slightly deeper level, more about what they're about beyond the CV, if you like, what you can see at the surface and find anywhere.
And we started out talking about stage one, where we said, this is your gut reaction. This is initial. When we get to stage two, one of the things that I think is that this is where we be even more intentional. I heard you say, your son is into hockey, but not just into hockey itself, maybe the New York Rangers, maybe the Minnesota Wild. And so I can look for opportunities to reconnect with you by maybe I read an article about what's going on with the Wild, or maybe I see something, or maybe, for whatever reason I'm in Minnesota and I can pick up a t-shirt or a coffee mug or something that I can share with you and take that relationship to the next level by building upon that initial commonality that we had.
Right. And it's a great signal to me if we meet, let's say 3 months later, after our first conversation, that you have taken the time to remember that, pick up the lead again, and follow up on that conversation. So I'm, as the recipient of this, going to feel very, kind of valued that you have taken the time to remember, you paid attention, you listened, and took the trouble to come back and ask me further about those questions. And that's really building trust, because I see that as somebody who shows interest, listens well, shows some empathy. These are the kinds of the things that I'm picking up without maybe being very conscious of them in what you're doing by referring back. And an extra layer to level 2, beyond just picking up on the interest and following up, is, and I get to this really in, asking smart, open questions, would be how can I use that interest in hockey to figure out what really motivates you? So, what are your values? So I might actually, beyond talking about the teams, say, so, how are things going for, him at school? Or, how are you managing, work-life balance with being a hockey mom
and on the board and following the team and all that.
Right. And so what you get into is a slightly deeper conversation about how it is for me, my experience, as opposed to the first level, which is just the interest. So stage 2 becomes an opportunity to explore and dig a bit deeper. What's important to this person? How important is her relationship with her son, or in your case with your kids? What else do you do? You might actually take it out a little further and say, we talked about hockey. What else do you guys do as a family? You want to kind of really get more information to check out whether your first impression in stage 1 was right, was valid, and you still want to build a relationship with this person going further.
Excellent. All right, we're going to move through stage 3 and stage 4 a little bit quicker. How about stage 3? Where do we go after digging a little deeper and referring back to the conversation?
So stage 2 goes along for quite a while, because as we keep meeting, we'll keep learning more and more about each other. So stage 2 really can be something that's more than just one encounter. It'll be over several months or maybe even a year or so, where we keep meeting and we just learn each other very well. So stage 3 becomes the opportunity to, instead of now only focusing and daring to focus on what we have in common, which is stages 1 and 2, because we're sticking to safe territory. We want to stay on common ground. We want to be agreeable with each other. We want to show each other that we like each other. If you get to stage 3, this is really a test of how much trust you've built, that you can start to disagree without it threatening the relationship. So now we'd be able to have conversations where, we could take perhaps a difference in politic or in religion or a viewpoint at work, a disagreement, and be able to thrash it out, but in a respectful way. And know that our disagreement doesn't define our relationship, that I know you so well and I know what kind of person you are and what your values are, that even if I don't agree with you on this point, I'm not going to be thinking, oh, that's just who he is as a person. I'll be thinking, okay, that's just his view. But, I know he's a good guy and I know him really well. So, I can let this one go, or it's okay that we disagree and work it out with, a bit of heat in the conversation.
And do you think one of the problems that we're having in stage 3 is that we're moving, well, not just stage 3, but do you think one of the problems we're having is that we're moving from stage 2 or trying to move from stage 2 to stage 3 too quickly? That we think we've built this strong relationship, so we start to move outside of common ground, and then that creates a division.
Exactly. I do. And I see it all the time when people come to me in working with leaders and teams. They'll say, a conflict has broken out, and we start to look at what's going on. And I say, well, I often ask the question, how well do you know these people? Oh, yeah, I do. I know them really well. They've been working here for years. Well, my question is a little bit different. It's not how long have you known them doing the job that they do? How well do you know the person?
What motivates them?
Right. Do you know what's going on for them outside of work? Do you know what really drives them? Do you know what their values are? Do you know what gets them out of bed in the morning to come to this job as opposed to leaving and working somewhere else?
As a leader, can we cross the line? Can we get to know our team too well that we ruin that professional relationship? Or is that not really something that we should worry about?
I'd like to see leaders being far more interested and curious and empathic about what's going on for the person as a whole, and seeing their employees and colleagues as a whole person, what's important to them outside of work as well as what they do in work. Where you might overstep the mark is really if you start to probe into areas of a person's life that you haven't been invited into. So, or asking questions that are going into personal issues that you haven't been invited into. If you've built trust through these stages, that will come up naturally and you'll be invited into those conversations. So often stage 3 is an issue because they've arrived at stage 3 thinking, I can disagree with you, I can challenge you, I can argue with you, but they didn't realize they hadn't built the trust to be able to do that in a safe way and not threaten the relationship.
And I would imagine that we find that there's some topics that we're in stage 2 and some topics that we're in stage 3. Like as a leader of my team, I may be able to talk about hockey and family and what you're doing on the weekend without any problem. We may be doing really well diving deep into those topics. But then when we think about topics such as religion or politics or something that's a little more touchy, maybe it's family in a certain individual's life, that they're not quite to stage 3 for that topic. Is that possible?
True. I agree with that. I think you have to be sure that you have built this trusting relationship together and that you're not assuming, which is always going to be the biggest challenge. If you've assumed that there is a mutual trust here and that you can launch into challenging and disagreeing and being, maybe antagonistic because you feel on safe ground, but the other person doesn't feel that towards you. And what's happened there is there hasn't been reciprocity. There hasn't been an exchange of information. You may well have asked a lot of questions, felt that you've really got to know the other person, but did you really open up to them? Did they get to know you in the same way? So this trust model is three-dimensional. It has to be mutual. There has to be two people involved in building trust.
How about stage 4?
So if we get to stage 3, we can disagree and we can survive it. And in fact, our disagreement maybe even creates new ideas. Through disagreeing and challenging each other's perspectives, something fresh comes up. That's great. We want to see that in teams, that they get to a point where they have so much trust, they know each other well, and they can start to spar with each other and disagree and brainstorm different perspectives and survive it well. Not just survive it, but thrive as a result of those different perspectives, the diversity. So stage 4 is where we have so much trust that we see teams coming together with the leader being able to create perhaps big, great heated discussions, different perspectives, brainstorm freely. Nobody feels threatened with, taking a different stance. Nobody feels uncertain about failing or experimenting, not getting it right. There's so much trust that this team now can really build on that and experiment and create and learn and fall and stand back up again, because the relationships are really what are at the core of this team. And it's no longer fragile because trust is really solid underground.
I'm thinking about some of these biographies that I've read recently of some of these great companies, and you hear about some of the top leadership that really build this stage 4 relationship where they can come in and they can hash it out and they can really go back and forth on what they think the direction and the product should go. And then at the end, they come together, decide on how they're going to go and move forward as a unified team. How often do you see teams making it to stage 4?
Actually, I see it very often. And I've certainly seen it when it isn't the case. And that's typically where you either have sudden changes within a team and they've assumed that the trust that was there before can be carried through with new members, or while there's a new challenge on the table and they haven't gone back to reestablish the trust amongst all members now with a new member coming in. So we have to remember that you may have had trust, you may have got to stage 4 with the existing team, but a new member comes in or the leader changes out, and suddenly, or you're part of a new merger, for example, and the rules of the game have changed. You have to go back and check out that you have the trust in place with everybody on board again, and not assume that you can just pick up where the other person has left. So I see it quite often that teams get to stage 4 quite quickly, where the leader has paid attention to relationship. And when the newcomer comes in, or if there is a change to the leader, and the leader themselves is new, they take the time to not only understand the work that we need to do as a team, the job, the tasks, the business strategy, whatever it is, but that we actually spend time outside of the tasks to get to know each other, spend time together, learning each other, understanding each other's motivations and drivers and personal lives, so that there's a natural glue, I call it, in kind of between the team, wanting to work together, seeking each other out, checking in on each other if they see that, somebody maybe looks like they don't have not having such a good day today. So it's more common, thankfully, than not. But it's certainly you will see that teams that go through rapid changes might lose their position on stage 4 if they don't take a conscious care of establishing trust again.
Well, this is a great conversation, and I love these 4 stages, and I love that we pulled them out for the listeners, that we can look intentionally in our lives of how we can move our relationships from 1 to 2 to 3 and hopefully to 4. And I'm interested to see how this plays out as we see more and more teams are shifting and adjusting at rapid rates, where the length of time that somebody spends in a job or with a company is shortening. As people transition more and more often. I'm interested to see how we can move from stage 1 to 4 more quickly with our teams. But alas, we're at a time in our podcast where we need to shift gears and talk about a section I call Learning from Leaders and jump into some of the stuff you're reading and listening to. How about that?
Great. Sounds super.
Perfect. All right. Our first question then is the book currently on your Kindle or bedside table. What are you reading?
I'm rereading a few books, actually, that inspired me many years ago, and I'm rereading The Alchemist as we speak.
It's interesting. This is the second week in a row that we've gotten The Alchemist as the book recommendation as far as what somebody's reading right now. And I see this wave of The Alchemist coming back through. I recently read it myself in a terrific book. Our second question then is your leadership superpower.
I did your assessment, Jake, and it came out as inspirational.
What you're talking about is the leadership superpower assessment to find one of the 5 leadership superpower platforms that you lead from. Inspirational. Tell me a little bit about that and how you felt as you discovered that is your superpower.
The way I viewed it is that I really like to encourage other people to find their superpower. So my curiosity for people and my interest in other people means that I often get feedback that the way I engage people and speak to people is inspiring to them. It may inspire them to, be more motivated for what they're doing, or to figure out a new direction, or just to create the sense of new possibilities and new opportunities. So in my leadership, I like to be able to inspire other people to find their full potential, whatever that's going to be.
What a great use of a superpower. That leads to our next question, which is a motivational quote, philosophy, or mantra. Inspire us.
I have a personal one, which I use a lot, which is don't confuse presence with influence. And what that means is a lot of leaders feel that they've arrived or achieved once they get the title or the salary or the mandate or the power or a seat at the table, which it's often called. And many a time I've seen that it's really not what it's about. Once you've got the title or the seat at the table, that's not where you're going to have your impact. It's really what you do with being there. So being present, having the title, having the position isn't enough. You really need to use and be conscious of your influence to create a positive working environment for everybody else.
Well said. Thank you very much. Our final question is, we're looking up on the bookshelf, and right next to the leadership pin code is a book that you would recommend. What is it?
So I've been rereading, as I mentioned, and the one I'm recommending right now is The Celestine Prophecy. It's an old text. It's one that I think has a lot of lessons about relationships and the importance of not ignoring casual encounters, unexpected meetings with people, and staying open-minded and curious to, I wonder what this conversation, whether it's somebody I've met at a networking event or somebody new at work, and not dismissing the relationships we have around us, but exploring them to see both what we might learn from them and what we may be able to give to them.
Thank you very much, Nashater. It's been wonderful to have you as a guest on the podcast. We ran a little long, which means our conversation was so enjoyable. We missed looking at the time. But before we let you go for today, give us an idea. Where can we find out more about you and pick up a copy of the Leadership Pin Code?
So a great place to find me is on LinkedIn. If you can remember my name, you can key me in and find me in there. Or on our website, which is progressingminds.com. And the book, The Leadership Pin Code, is on Amazon.
Awesome. And we'll link all of that up on the show notes so they can click on, go to your LinkedIn, go to your website, and go to Amazon and pick up a copy of this book. Thank you so much for coming on the episode today and being this week's Modern Leader.
It was such a great conversation. Thank you very much, Jay. I really enjoyed it.
All right, my friends, and a big thank you to Nashater for coming on and talking about influence, talking about how we can build trust as a team leader and as a member of the team. And as we close out the conversation, I was saying to Nashater, I was saying, hey, this was such a great conversation. I didn't realize where the time went. I like to keep these episodes around 30 minutes. We went a little bit longer than that because the topic is so fascinating. Building trust is not something that just happens. Sometimes I guess you don't know that it happens, but as Nashater was talking about, that usually occurs when we've gone through the stages unconsciously or subconsciously. But the more that we're intentional, the more that we do this intentionally, the faster we can get to trust and the faster we can get to the opportunity as a team and as a team leader to really build our experience and our organization. All right. Everything that we talked about on this week's episode of the podcast can be found at jakeacarlson.com/ML184, episode 184. And until next week, I want to wish you the very best of days, an even better life. And remember, everything is figure-outable. Thanks for listening to the Modern Leadership Podcast. You can find me on Facebook at Speaker Jake, on Twitter at Jake A. Carlson, and of course the website, jakeacarlson.com. See you there.